Hello, good evening. Welcome to the roast of Charlie Keil. My name is Alberto Zambenedetti. I am the director of the Cinema Studies Institute. Before we proceed, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been a traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. 2025 is a special year for the Cinema Studies Institute. It is our 50th anniversary, and we're gathered here tonight to hear from those of us who had the privilege to serve as Cinema Studies Institute directors throughout its history. But let me first say that CSI's first mission is, of course, to launch the careers of the many students, both graduate and undergraduate, who year after year choose to make the Institute their intellectual home. CSI graduates have gone on to pursue careers in all corners of the profession, from the film industry to academia, from programming to criticism, to becoming novelists and filmmakers in Canada and abroad. By all standards, CSI has become one of the premier locations in the world to study cinema. The 50th anniversary series is meant to celebrate this long and storied history and the people who contributed to shaping it. It's also an opportunity to think about the students who will join us in the future and whose careers we hope to launch. And for this reason, I invite you all to contribute by donating, if you are able, to the Cinema Studies Fund. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce the people who served as Cinema Studies Institute directors. In the interest of time, I will give only brief biographical sketches of the panelists. Professor Bliss Lim, who kindly agreed to moderate the panel, would situate each one in a CSI timeline she was able to reconstruct from memory and somehow incomplete records. And I'm grateful to her and amazed by her sleuthing abilities. So, first and foremost, Professor Joe Medjuck was a BA in Honors English from McGill University and an MA and PhD from the University of Toronto. Also a renewed TV and film producer, author, and journalist. Professor Emeritus Cameron Tolton, Honors BA in Classics and French from the University of Toronto, and an AM and PhD in Romance Languages and Literature from Harvard University. Professor Peter Fitting, who studied French literature at St. Mary's College of California at the University of Minnesota, and then went on to pursue graduate work at Harvard. Professor Charlie Keil, who holds a BA from the University of Toronto and an MA and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Corinn Columpar, who has a BA from Yale University and an MA and a PhD from Emory University. And then me. And I hold the laurea from Ca' Foscari University in Venice, an MA and a PhD from New York University. Our moderator, Professor Bliss Lim, and I'm going to give her a little bit more time and a more complete biography, is the author of Translating Time, Cinema, and the Fantastic and Temporal Critique, which was published in 2009, and a member of the editorial collective of the journal Camera Obscura, Feminism, Culture, and Media Studies, in the advisory board of Plaridel, a Philippine journal of communication, media, and society. A recent book, The Archival Afterlife of Philippine Cinema, which was published at Duke University Press in 2024, analyzes the crisis-ridden history of film archiving in the Philippines. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lim to the lectern.
Thank you, Alberto. Thanks, everyone, for being here. This is just an amazing turnout. I'm just thrilled that so many folks could come, and very grateful to our distinguished panelists for joining us this evening. I'm very new to the Cinema Studies Institute and very honored to be moderating this evening as the new girl, as one of the new girls, and so I'll do my best. As people who work with archives know, the history of institutions is vested in people, lodged in the memories of social actors rather than in a paper trail. This means that rare opportunities to forge a collective oral history together, like tonight's directors panel, are extremely precious and rare. I'll begin by sketching a rough chronology before posing some opening questions for our panel, and then I think we should have enough time for an open forum and Q&A at the end. So I did this over the weekend from Bart Testa's writing, from another article that Alberto found, and then from the collective memory of folks over email. And then as we went to dinner, I discovered that there were already glaring gaps. And so this is the best that we can reconstitute. Around 1968, there were two early film courses taught at U of T. One was by Father Bob Fink on French cinema, and another was by Father Arthur Gibson, a course on Ingmar Bergman. In 1969 to 1970, Joe Medjuck, who joins us today, then a PhD student in English and co-editor and co-publisher of the pioneering Canadian film journal Take One, taught the first film intro course at U of T. It was supposedly called Modern Arts, the Cinema, but Joe says, I thought it was just called Intro to Film 101. 1973 is the year that Cam Tolton started teaching a film intro course at Victoria College. In 1974, Kay Armitage, who I just met moments ago, very delighted, who was developing the women's studies program at U of T, taught a course on women's cinema. This was an era when colleagues in various departments at U of T, self-made film scholars, were pioneering the teaching of cinema here at the University of Toronto. When in 1975, cinema studies became an academic program housed at Innis College, cinema studies became the center of energy for these courses collectively. In the mid-1970s, Innis College settled into its custom-built home, this very building, our present-day Innis College, with Innis Town Hall, a state-of-the-art screening center at its heart. U of T's Audiovisual Library, or AVL, had been in existence since the early 1970s in the basement of a house on the east side of St. George Street long before its later relocation to Robarts Library. In the late 1970s to the early 1980s, cinema faculty began coordinating with the Audiovisual Library to build a film collection at U of T for teaching purposes. This was the precursor of today's Media Commons, the largest repository for both archival and contemporary audiovisual research resources in any Canadian university. In 1980, Bart Testa, who came out of NYU's Graduate Cinema Studies program and had been a TA in the late 1970s, started teaching cinema studies at U of T. Charlie Keil and Cass Banning were also among the cinema studies program's first TAs in the early 80s. In 1994, Cam Tolton became director, and he recalls that cinema studies, which had been a decanal program, was formally turned over to Innis College in 1999. He also hired under his directorship Cass Banning to teach a course on film theory, and of course she has gone on to become one of the pillars here at CSI. Around 2000, under Peter Fitting's directorship, Corinn Columpar, Nick Salmond, and Angelica Fenner joined cinema studies at U of T. In 2005, Charlie Keil became director, and the process of becoming an institute and launching graduate programs began in earnest. Faculty could now be hired without cross appointments, enabling the faculty to grow. Rob King was hired around this time. In 2007, the Cinema Studies Institute, as we know it, was established. Its first MA cohort was admitted. James Keil arrived in 2010. Brian Price and Megan Sutherland, whose hires originated at U of T Mississauga, joined the Cinema Studies graduate program in 2011. In 2013, Cinema Studies admitted its first PhD cohort. In 2014, Corinn Columpar became director. Under her directorship, Alberto Zambenedetti, Scott Richmond, Lauren Kramer, and Sarah Salju, also hired through UTM, joined our faculty. In 2019, under James Cahill's directorship, many strategic hires, originating both at St. George and Mississauga, further expanded the Institute's undergraduate and graduate programs. Liz Wijaya, Nadine Chan, Rakesh Sangupta, Brett Story, myself, and Erica Hollis O'Neill. I arrived in the fall of 2022, and I'm very grateful to be here. Last year, 2024, Alberto Zambenedetti assumed the directorship, and he has been energetically at the helm for Cinema Studies' 50th anniversary year. So I guess our panelists should all be seated. So the first question would be, how has the institution changed throughout the years from your vantage point? Or alternately, how was cinema studies viewed by the university, and how has this changed through time? And so we'll start with you, Joe.
Well, it's obviously, oh, sorry. These are much better quarters than when I was teaching. I gave my first classes in what was a living room at 63 Sussex, 63 St. George, and we'd put up a screen at one end of the room and a projector at the other end, and the students would sit on the floor and screen movies. It was only, we didn't have any facilities. We didn't have any films. We had to get films from distributors or embassies or anywhere we could. And that was one of the biggest problems, was actually finding films that we wanted to talk about. The films in those days were very ephemeral. They were things you mainly saw in movie theaters. If you went once and you wanted to see it again, you had to go again, if you were lucky, if it was on. There were no collections unless you lived near the Museum of Modern Art in New York or the Cinémathèque in Paris. So everything in film studies around the world has changed a great deal in the last 50 years. Actually, I started 56 years ago today, or this year. And Innes College as a building didn't exist. I was actually the chairman of the building committee that built this building. The biggest thing we fought about was whether or not the restroom should be co-ed or not. And it did put in a room for screenings, but you've redone it really, really well since we did it.
Well, I tend to think of the history of cinema studies at Toronto in 50 years being divided into two halves. The first half, the 20th century, and that was 25 years, and the second half, the 21st century, another 25 years. And there's a dramatic change that occurs about around 2000. I retired in 2001, so I'm very well acquainted with the first half. I don't know much about the second half. But as Joe described it, it was a building project all the way through. And when I became the director in 1994, I was the third director at that point. The first two, now deceased, unfortunately, and I'll talk about them in a few moments. They deserve all the credit for a lot of what's gone on here. Well, when I became the director in 1994, we had a review of the Cinema Studies program at the University of Toronto that very fall. I started in September, and we had a review where the review was very good. We were teaching undergraduate courses. We were not teaching graduate courses. And the undergraduate courses were reviewed as being excellent. We had excellent instructors. We had wonderful students. The student numbers had grown. But, and this was an enormous but, we were unknown outside the University of Toronto. And for that very reason, we were scolded, and we were told that one thing we should do is make what we had here, which was so good, known to the rest of the world. Well, what we had here was a program for specialists, for majors, and for minors. This had been going on since 1982, this program. Before that, there had been the 1970s, which were glorious in their own way for a curriculum. Why? Because the Faculty of Arts and Sciences offered a smorgasbord. You could take whatever courses you wanted. You didn't have to do a major. You didn't have to do a specialist. You just took your courses. Wonderful for the instructors, because you never had a student in your class who didn't want to be there. And the students were just wonderful to be with. We taught them all kinds of things. We did not have projectionists in the courses. We taught them how to be projectionists because they had to do their own projecting. And we were grateful for all of that. But we had to become better known. So what I did at that point was found what was called a bulletin for the program called Cine News. And Cine News came out twice a year, and it was circulated to alumni. and to high schools. And the idea was that high schools were going to learn about cinema studies at the University of Toronto and perhaps actually come to the U of T to take cinema courses. Well, I don't know really what the direct effect of this was, but by 1999, we had a double first-year course. We filled this room twice, 200 students twice, over 400 students in the intro course, so something had worked there. Cine News was also supposed to be a fundraising vehicle because the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science had said, we do need to have some more funding from cinema studies graduates. We weren't getting any. We weren't very effective in that way. That was not exactly what we were up to at that time, and it was not effective at all. But the program did come to be much better known, and in the following years, thanks to a lot of people other than myself, other directors who have followed, who are all sitting beside me.
As Cam pointed out, we could look at the program and say the first 25 years and then the second 25 years, and I was the director right at that turning point. Before, as has been described, the instructors, first it was some people who started, like Joe, who started teaching courses, and then gradually within departments where the cinema studies program came into existence, but the courses were still not being funded in any formal way. And then gradually there were arrangements with departments, and then came moments when we could actually go with the dean to a department and have a joint appointment. And that's the anecdote that I want to tell right now, because that's what's really changed. This not having to anymore pair up with a department. We had an appointment we could make. The current principal of the college at that time, Frank Cunningham, was in the philosophy department. It was an idea, why not pair up with philosophy? There was a famous example, Francis Sparshot, of a philosopher who had, at the University of Toronto, who had written about film. So we paired up with philosophy. At the first meeting, it became clear, at least to me, that this was a big mistake. Philosophy basically said, yeah, the candidates have to have a PhD in philosophy. Okay, well, that narrowed it down quite a bit. I think we had a couple hundred applications at that point when we were able to get it down to 4 or 5. But then we realized that the philosophy department, they were going to hire a philosopher who liked to go to the movies. That was their view of cinema studies. That, whatever you want to call it, that attitude, that condescension really irritated us. And the hire fell apart. It didn't happen. The dean tried to get us to do it again with philosophy, and we basically said no. So that was the turning point. The hires that came after, Corinn and Nick Salmon, were solid film people, and that was our last attempt. That was the last moment when we had to go through this business of trying to pair up with a department who would then condescend to us. We're now, as will be pointed out, we're now a strong department. We have an MA and a PhD program, and we make our own hires, and we find the best candidates, and we have the best professors. So that's the formative experience for me in being the director who came from the French department to the cinema studies. So I'll pass it on to my successor.
So something Cam said, I think, is really resonant here, which is that cinema studies at the time had a really strong undergraduate program, but with the mindset of U of T, if you didn't have graduate instruction, you were a second-order unit. Peter has said this as well. And I remember when we were pushing the processes forward to get graduate instruction, you'd sit in this big room with all these administrators from different departments, and I remember there'd be someone like physics saying, is cinema studies actually a thing? that they had no conception, because there was no, from their perspective, there was no presence within this research institution of graduate level instruction. So Cinema Studies, despite all the best efforts of all the people who were teaching in it, all the people from the language departments, but then we also have to, again, mention people like Keil and Bart Testa, who were doing a lot of the heavy lifting of the, the core teaching, that it was just not being paid attention to because it was only undergrads, which is a sad state of affairs when a university thinks that way, but it's a research institution. And I'll just say one other thing in this regard, because I see some people in the room. We had great undergraduate students. I shouldn't say we, because I wasn't teaching at this point, but there were great undergrad students like Mike Zrid who would have to go to the US to get their graduate degrees. And I think the thinking was we shouldn't be losing these students. We should be keeping some of them closer to hand. So that was the motivation for creating a graduate program. And I will say that what I noticed in my time is I kind of sat in the director's chair for 9 years, I think it was, but Kay was acting director 2 of those years, so I wasn't like, it appears in the record that it was 9, but it really effectively was not. But what I was going to say is that was long enough for me to be able to see the change in attitude towards cinema studies during that time. Once we became an institute, and once we had graduate instruction, I'd go by and people go like, cinema studies, yeah. Like, okay. And the idea was that now you've joined the big boys club, right? Now you're on par with the other kinds of units at this university that have graduate instruction. And I think what's sad about that is it was such a strong unit for so many years, and it just wasn't given the respect it deserved from this university. And so I'm really glad that we, the people who kind of push forward with graduate, were able in a way to do that for our forebears, because they deserve that because of so much that they did for the program in its undergraduate only years. And some of the people here I know only experienced it when it was undergrad, and they loved the program. Like, it did such great things for them. So I just want to say, I don't know, this is not turned into one of these maudlin, thank you so much. But I do want to sort of tip my hat to, the people to the right of us, and also to Kay, who's here, and then, of course, to Bart.
Yeah, it's funny, this is not from my years as director, but I was reflecting on the 22 years that I've been here, and I feel like the largest change I experienced was actually the 2007 when we got an MA program. Everything seemed all of a sudden a bit different in terms of how we were perceived, and in terms of how we perceived ourselves, in terms of what we were able to do in our undergraduate classrooms, and then also, of course, what we were all of a sudden able to do in a graduate classroom. Prior to that point, we would rely on TA power for the introduction course from other units. So Comp Lit students, for example, or English students would TA for us. And once we had MA students, all of a sudden we had our own students in the classroom. We were able to give TA support to other core courses as well, which was really nice. And there was just a different spirit that prevailed. I just last week had coffee with somebody who was in the second cohort, the second MA cohort, and we were really reminiscing about how it felt like a really exciting time because we were all building something. And the students who were there at that time really had a sense that they were contributing to this thing that was alive, that was taking shape before everybody's eyes, and that they were contributing very actively to that. And what's remarkable about those early years is that so many of those people have gone on to do incredibly interesting things, some of them in academia and some of them elsewhere. And that has only continued in subsequent years. I'm not saying those years were exceptional, but there was a real spirit of change that occurred around that time. But I will say that, with Charlie at the helm and Kay on occasion as well, so many things happened. We established an MA program, we established a PhD program, and we became an EDUA, which meant that we were all of a sudden able to actually hire our own faculty, which was very exciting for a faculty member like me who was hired into the English department in order to teach cinema. It was very exciting to all of a sudden be able to be part of cinema studies proper, exclusively. Because that's where I always felt that I belonged. I know when I became director, I just felt like, because I came in 2014, so a year after the PhD program, and it felt like, okay, we are huge all of a sudden, and we need to catch up to all of this growth that has occurred. And so I know that in my period of time as director, one of the most important goals was just simply to figure out how to sail such a big ship as we had become. And that meant really thinking about cultivating our faculty, pushing them through the promotion process, hiring faculty whenever we could, and making sure that we could actually, instruct all of these students that we all of a sudden had in our MA program and our PhD program. And then the last thing I'm going to say is that as much as we're talking about things that have changed, the thing that I think I'm most proud of as a member of the faculty here is that one thing that has never changed is our utter commitment to undergraduate education. I think that we provide really fantastic education for our undergraduate students. It remains one of our top goals. When we hire faculty, we put candidates through this incredibly terrible process that I too had to go through, which is you have to walk into one of our huge lecture courses and give a lecture, in addition to doing a research talk. And when we decide whom we want to hire, we think a lot about how they performed in that particular context. And that's a real sign that this is something that we value highly and we prioritize when we are adding to our faculty. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, so I am the new kid, and I should acknowledge that there is a gap here, and it's a very substantial gap, and it's the space that James Keil occupied, and a lot of people have benefited from his directorship, which was spectacular in many ways. He added a lot of lines. He really created, a wonderful, welcoming culture for a lot of students and graduate students, and for people like myself as well. And I also need to acknowledge the two people that hired me, because I was hired in installments in some ways, Corinn and Charlie. And what I can say is that it's too early for me to say really how the place has changed, but I do feel an enormous responsibility because of this very long and history. And this panel kind of like shows already how every little thing had to be negotiated and had to be fought for and advocated for, and everything was a little conquest on its own merit. And I want to say the ship metaphor is really apt, because I remember distinctly Charlie was my faculty mentor when I was hired, and I'm hired between Italian, some of you know, between Italian and cinema studies, and I always felt that, and it's a very difficult but also very convenient position, because if you have, a gripe with one department, you can find shelter in the other, and vice versa. And often these, are sort of ebbs and flows, and you really go from one place to the next, and 1 year you're okay here, and then you find, that kind of thing. And for me, historically, it has been that CSI has been my shelter from perhaps some pressure that was put on me as a junior faculty member. And I remember distinctly at lunch I had with Charlie, where Charlie sort of talked me down and calmed me down, and you're like, you are now on the ocean liner of departments, he said to me, very immodestly, but it's a kind of immodesty that's earned by all the work and the foundations that were laid here.
I mean Titanic.
I sure hope you didn't, because this, right now, I would be the captain sinking it. So not seeing the iceberg coming, and maybe, who knows, what's going on south of the border, right? So, but, Charlie kind of talked me down, and it's like, now you are on the ocean liner, you're safe, you're okay, you're gonna be fine. And I never would I have imagined 10 years later that I would be tasked with the responsibility of doing this. And it's a terrific honor and a privilege, of course. You've seen the history.
I was wondering when the ocean liner metaphor was going to come out, and now it's out, and yeah, now we can play with it. I was wondering if I could ask Cam a follow-up question, and it's something that you and I have been emailing quite a bit, I think for 2 weekends, and you're wonderful, my favorite email correspondent of this winter. And you were talking about how in the early years before cinema studies had achieved program status, a lot of the cinema classes, of course there wasn't a cinema program. So necessarily, a lot of the classes were in fact being taught by colleagues in language departments at U of T. And you described them as self-made film scholars. And of course, you know, when you wrote me that, I thought about how, you know, the era that you're talking about is the era before the proliferation of graduate programs in film studies, right? So it makes perfect sense. And so I was wondering if you could talk a bit about what it was like to be teaching cinema at U of T and the culture of cinema at U of T at a moment before or on the cusp of the professionalization of the discipline of cinema studies itself.
Well, thank you for asking that question. We as instructors who had the whim to teach a cinema course in some cases, and in other cases been requested to teach one for one reason or another, we were untrained as cinema scholars because there was no PhD program for us to have taken. So we all had our degrees in something else, such as a language course. Peter Fitting and I did our PhDs both at Harvard with the same thesis director at different times, him being younger, but we were there working under a man by the name of Brick Frohawk. And Brick Frohawk was a man who had a cinema studies connection because he was from Maine, and his very best friend was a man named James Agee, who wrote a script for The African Queen and was a major film reviewer before we had ever heard of other people who have become more famous since. So when we began teaching, we took it seriously. I could tell you something that's rather interesting about how I came to be a film teacher. I was at Victoria College, and I had lunch every day at the high table in Burwash Hall. And there I just did what I usually do. I talked about movies with all the people who were there at the table. Anybody who was there who wanted to talk about film, and I was talking about it, but I didn't think about it much beyond that. Well, at that time, the Ontario provincial government, the Conservative government of the time, had decided that the federated colleges here on campus, Trinity, Victoria, and St. Michael's, should not get the same kind of funding as University College and the rest of the university, because we were federated, we were connected with churches. And they assumed that the churches in each case had financed us to the point where the government didn't need to finance us that much. Victoria found itself very embarrassed because people were leaving the traditional college courses, which were English, French, philosophy, German, Near Eastern studies, religious studies. So the numbers were dropping. And they decided that what they were going to do was give money to each of the federated college according to the number of students who were being taught under the roof of that college at that time. And our numbers were not adding up. So Victoria College decided to up the numbers by doing what Innes College had. They were going to have a popular course, and their course was going to be cinema studies. And they put it on for a year, but they were not wanting to spend any money on it. They had to hire somebody to teach it, and they did. They hired somebody who was from Oise, and the person was confronted with 100 students and no teaching assistant, and had a rather casual way of reaching final marks in the course. The academic committee at Victoria College was horrified by this. Victoria College, in case you don't know it, is a very traditional college which values its reputation and considers it to be prestigious. I was honored to be a teacher there. But they recognized this wasn't working. So somebody on the committee suggested, well, we should get somebody in the college who knows about things like assigning essays and having tests and maybe an examination, something like that. And they said, well, Cam talks a lot about movies at the high table. Well, I talked a lot about it, but it all came from a misspent youth. I had spent my time going to the Runnymede Theatre and the Esquire Theatre in West Toronto every Saturday afternoon until I got old enough to go to the Friday evening movie screenings as well. And somebody came to me and said, Cam, would you teach a film course? And I said, would I teach a film course? Well, what do you mean, teach a film course? Well, something like that they have over at Innis. And I said, well, would you pay me for that? And they said, yes. I said, well, yes, right away. And then I thought, well, now what do I do? Well, I insisted that I have a teaching assistant, and that was going to cost the money. They didn't like that because they were going to get me for free. They were going to take me out of one of my French courses, and I wouldn't cost them a penny. And I said, I got to have an assistant if I'm going to have 100 students. So they did pay for an assistant, and a very good one indeed. She stayed with me for 3 years, Sandra Sushot. And then I found myself with all these students. But then I thought, that's not enough. I've got to read a lot more film history, film theory, film analysis. So I spent a summer of '73 getting myself into shape. I wanted to get myself really up into a very good shape for teaching it. And then I thought, that's not enough. I really have to learn filmmaking. So I enrolled myself at, dare I say the word, the former Ryerson University? Well, that's where I enrolled myself. And I took a filmmaking course while I was teaching my very first course. And that was not very good because film was so popular at that time that the Ryerson course had hundreds of students in it, and we never got our hands on the filmmaking equipment to make the films. So I had to enroll the next year in another course called, it was at the Three Schools, which was a kind of alternative school, you would say, on Bathurst, just at Bathurst and Bloor, across from the Brunswick House. You could take your coffee breaks in the Brunswick for a beer if you wanted to in the middle of the course. Well, we got hands-on, had a very good instructor, a man named Clark Mackey, who eventually taught at Queen's University. He put up with the whole lot of us, and we made a film at that point. And that was great. So I found myself finally almost equipped to teach film studies as I really wanted to. But we were still, of course, called amateurs. And in our various reviews all through the 90s, we were described as amateurs. But we were scholars. And I dare anybody to find an article that's better on Stagecoach than by my colleague, David Clanfield, who was from the French department. It's a wonderful article that should be reread all the time, and probably is. Or to read anything about Canadian cinema and Nell Shipman, written by Kay Armitage. That was a beautiful piece, and here she is tonight. Good for you. And then there's Barry Hayne, who was one of my very best friends, who taught Australian cinema for briefly, but usually taught American silent or novel into film. And he was a scholar too. He were talking about people who turned themselves into film scholars without having PhDs in film studies. There was nothing to be ashamed of the quality of the teaching at that time. That's why it was difficult to work in that period with, and these are the villains of the piece, in case you were ever wondering who the villains are.
Hey, villains.
The deans of the time were the villains. There were good deans and there were bad deans. The very first dean, who was around at the time when film studies became a committee and went into the program, was a man named Bob Green. He was an English professor who had become the dean, and he and Joe and Peter Russell, the principal of Innis, the three of them were responsible for putting together a program that Bob Green, dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science, truly believed in. And because this was a dean, we became a committee and a program that answered to the dean and not to the principal of Innes College. But he was a wonderful dean. Another wonderful dean was somebody by the name of Robin Armstrong. When we were first teaching our courses, and I was teaching my courses at Victoria, Innes wasn't here. I was teaching at Victoria. Finally, in 1975, Innes College was here, and we sent our students over here for some screenings. Our screenings were at the Medical Sciences Auditorium, right, Joe? That was where our... That's right. I'm cursed with extraordinary memory, I'm sorry to say. So I do remember these things, and that was it, at the Medical Sciences Auditorium. So what happened there was we were teaching all over the campus, all these people. Louis Barn in Slavic studies, Peter Harris in German, David Clanfield in French, in English, first Barry Hayne and Gino Matteo, and then later Anne Lancashire. Oh, another great scholar, Anne Lancashire, who has written better stuff on Star Wars than Anne Lancashire. We're dealing with top quality there, and the students deserve that kind of top quality. In one of my undergraduate classes, an intro course taught in 1981 and 82, I had maybe about 80 to 100 students there. 4 people went on to do PhDs out of that intro course eventually. That's what we were dealing with, and we were so proud of them all. When we first founded this, Joe, you and Kay and I and Wendy Rolfe and Gino Matteo and Peter Harris, when we all founded this, the very first meeting when we all came together, met for the first time, 3 of my very best friends of all time came out of that meeting, Gino and Wendy and Barry. It was a wonderful day. And we knew that something good was going to come out of that. That was the year before the program was actually founded, because we had to work to it. And we had to convince the world, not just deans, because Bob Green was already convinced. But can you imagine, in 1973, 74, when we were talking about this, dealing with the classics department of the University of Toronto, the classics department at University College, at Trinity College, at Victoria College. Imagine teaching cinema. That's entertainment. Well, I want you to know that a few years later, they caught on. And a professor by the name of Des Conacher at Trinity College really caught on. And he offered a course for the Cinema Studies program in adaptation of epic and tragedy from Greek and Roman times. And ironically, and this is the greatest irony of all, what were the films he taught? Helen of Troy with Rosanna Podesta. Ulysses with Kirk Douglas, exactly the kind of peplum film that these people were condemning from the first, thinking that that was probably what we were going to be teaching. We were teaching great auteur. We were teaching great classic films. But I want to say this too, since I have the mic. Thank you. I want to say this. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to thank Joe Medjuck, sitting beside me, who taught us so much about teaching cinema from the very first. He was the most generous person to find as an established teacher in the program, so kind with his time, and I learned so many things from him that helped me in teaching. And if David Clanfield were here too, he would say the same thing, because we were all teaching intro together in the same year. So thank you, Joe.
Cam's point about academics, it was almost an accident that I was an academic. I was very interested in film, but it was true around the world, by the way. I got through with Keil, got very friendly with Peter Wolin and Laura Mulvey, and all these people were freelance intellectuals. They had no jobs. You know, the British Film Institute under Paddy Watt now, I think, found ways to get them a little stipends, but they were literally starving to death. And they didn't get jobs in academia till like 30 years later. I mean, Peter did end up at UCLA. Laura was at the University of London, I believe. But I was one of the only people actually getting paid by a university that I knew of to teach film. And I didn't feel, I do want to say I missed this in the first question you asked. You asked about the relationship to the university. I didn't feel, to be honest, didn't feel I was working for the university. I thought I was working for Innis College. I mean, you had so much trouble getting jobs here. People were saying, I got the job. I was walking across the campus one day, ran into someone who said, hey, they're looking for you at Innis College. They want to give a film course. And I think the only reason they knew about me was I had created a course for the then called Extension Department, and which involved film. It was about culture, and it was called the Introduction to Contemporary Arts, I think. And every second week I showed a film. And then the next year I actually gave a film course with a friend from a film society named Clive Denton. And so I had given a film course. I'd managed to get an MA. I was studying for my PhD from the Graduate Center for the Study of Drama. I was writing about, I'm just going to say this to bore you to death. I was supposedly writing a thesis about the rise of naturalism in the 19th century British theater, the influence of T.W. Robertson on A.W. Pinero and Henry Arthur Jones. My thesis supervisor was Robertson Davies, who was the only person who knew who any of these people were. And meanwhile, I was starting to teach film because I'd come over to Innis College that day and they just hired me. And they said, go create a course. And no one ever questioned it. I think I was reasonably responsible. But I didn't feel anything about the university in general. I just thought Innis College offered, I think all at once, one year they offered a film course, film studies, environmental studies, and urban studies. And then later, New College did women's studies, I think. But it was, and so I just felt I was working for Innis College, and we didn't have a building. I was working out of 63 St. George here. And gradually, real academics started to get involved, like Cam and David Clanfield, people who already had their PhDs probably. I eventually, by the way, everything happens to me just walking across campus. I walked across campus, ran into Joseph Skoretsky, who was a friend of mine, and he was teaching at the Graduate Center for the Study of Drama, and said, we were talking and wondering why you weren't writing about film. And I said I didn't think they'd let me. So I immediately ran across campus and saw the head of the department, who said, you've only got 2 years left to do your PhD. And I said, I'm much more likely to finish it if I write about film than if I continue writing about the rise of naturalism in the 19th century British theater. And so I did that, and poor Joseph became my thesis supervisor. He said it gave him a headache to read it. It was mainly influenced by Gombrich, who'd written a book called Art and Illusion, which is not about film, but I basically ripped him off and wrote about film. And I'd been introduced by him by Marcia McLuhan, who I'd been studying with, or I'd taken a couple courses from. You didn't exactly study with McLuhan. And so I came in the back way completely. But I always felt, to be honest, more attached to Innis College than to the University of Toronto. And these guys were working hard to make it possible to do all the things they did. I was just thinking of creating courses to teach and things like that. The closest I came to this was certainly a joke. When we opened this theater, and it wasn't as nice as it is now, I remember standing at the front, and they were popular courses because they sounded easy. You go watch a movie, And I would make a speech at the beginning of every year. This was before you made it respectable, Cam, and I'd say, this is a really easy course to pass. do the work, hand in a paper. You may not get a good mark, but you'll pass. And I don't need to worry about having a grade curve, because enough of you are not going to do that. I will beg you to do it, and you still won't do it. When you have 300 students, that happens. Like 50 of them are going to disappear. Their parents are worried about them, but they aren't going to hand their papers in. And I said, but it's going to be very hard to get a good mark. I have fairly high standards about film scholarship. And don't come to me at the end of the year and say, you need to get an A because you want to go to med school. I'd say, just taking this course means you won't get into med school. And
Everyone deserves a career in stand-up, but I am having so much fun at this panel, and I just have to enshrine some of the most amazing lines that were just said. Cam, you helped me realize that it was my misspent youth that made me a film scholar too, and now I want that as a bumper sticker on my old car. And Joe, I wish that I could say that walking across campus, someone offered me a job, but at the very least, I identify with your saying, I was reasonably responsible. I love these lines. Okay, so my follow-up question, and this is for anyone to weigh in. Could you talk about specific transformative moments, whether good or bad, under your directorship, either in terms of accomplishments or challenges or both? Or if you don't want to talk about transformative moments, maybe you'd like to talk about what about the job of the director did you find most surprising or interesting or challenging? And anyone can hop in. Yeah.
I'm going to go to the bathroom before I come back.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah. Charlie?
Yeah. So we didn't have a lot of faculty when we when the decision was made that we should try for the graduate degrees and the upgrade of our status. And at the time, I don't remember why it was, but there weren't a lot of people around to help. Nick and Corinn were still relatively junior, I think, at that time. And we had, I won't name who it was, but we had an assistant. We just had one staff person. Peter's laughing because he knows who it is. And that person was often not around. And then we had a professor from the Italian department who had agreed to be the graduate coordinator when we started our grad program. So we had a very precarious set of things in place. They all fell apart. And so it was really just, I think now back on this and think how ramshackle the whole effort was, because really there were like 3 of us consulting, and maybe 4 consulting, and then massive amounts of paperwork.
What year is this?
2005 or 5, I guess, right? And then 5, 6, so that period. And the U of T is probably the most bureaucratic academic institution on the planet, and I think they're proud of it. And so to navigate that with so few people on board to do it, I don't know if that's a transformative moment, I don't know what it is, but I'm now looking back and thinking, I have no idea how that happened. It just seems almost like a miracle that we were able to effect that transformation. But I mean, that just shows the dedication to the people who were around at that time. And so, yeah, that wasn't much of an anecdote now that I think about it, but.
You worked on me, Corinn.
I was just going to say, I wouldn't use the word ramshackle. I always think of us in those days as very scrappy. I felt like I became part of a scrappy unit who had such large aspirations and yeah, not a lot of person power to make them happen. But another thing, and this is probably the thing that I was happiest about during my directorship, was it used to be the case that cinema studies research stream faculty had a teaching load that was much larger, was larger than that of a lot of other units on campus, particularly cognate units. And one of the things that I did upon becoming director is petition the dean's office to change our teaching load, which we were able to do, which meant that people could actually be functioning researchers for the entirety of the school year. Prior to that point, there were semesters where everybody was teaching 3 courses. And it's really impossible to sustain a research program doing that. So when our research load, or when our teaching load, was lowered, it allowed for people to devote more time to their scholarship, but also to all of the administrative work that all of a sudden was on all of us, because we were supervising students, whether they were writing a major research paper as an MA student or starting to work on the process of putting together a dissertation as a PhD student. So I do think that people were really working hard in those years when all those things were coming together and didn't necessarily have much time to do so. So there was a kind of scrappiness that was really impressive, but it's also nice to move into that next phase where you actually have a little bit more time, a little bit more space to actually do the kind of work that's required to continue fueling that program. Maybe not as it grows, but just as it simply sustains itself.
I remember the dean said to me when we were initiating this process, and he said, what you need is critical mass. He was a physicist. And I thought, it seemed like a Yoda-like pronouncement, because I had no idea what he meant, and I didn't feel I could ask him. And I think what he really meant was, you're going to have to figure out how to marshal the very few faculty resources you have to push this through, because you have to look like you're bigger than you are. And then what was interesting about that is then after we got the status, it was like, it really was like a door to a magic kingdom open. Once we were given this ability to make our own hires, then they followed. It was almost like the Cinema Studies was good all along, but there was no recognition of it. And I think it was partly because the people like that Cam has mentioned were kind of holding up the teaching by virtue of doing it through their departments as kind of almost like freebies. And then once we had that status, it was like, okay, now you can go and find your own people. And that's what happened, especially with Corinn's and James's years, is just like a lot of very smart hires of very capable people that then made it feel like, yeah, we have enough people now that we can do what we need to do.
So I want to pose the next question and maybe put it to Joe specifically, but anybody can jump in. Could you talk about the link between cinema studies at U of T and Canadian film culture, broadly conceived? So this could be in terms of filmmaking, production cultures, media industries, or in terms of scholarly research or popular film writing, or the links between U of T and key film institutions like TIFF. So anyone?
I'll start backwards. I put on the least popular program TIFF has ever had. I did a season of Marguerite Duras films, many of which were shown with no subtitles. And about 20 people came, but they liked it. The 20 people who came were very appreciative. I would say that when I started teaching film, it was a manifestation of a movement rather than a cause in any way. I mean, David Cronenberg, when I got to U of T, David Cronenberg was running around with a script called Orgy of the Blood Parasites, which eventually became Shivers. Adam Egoyan, I produced a movie with Adam a few years back, and he very nicely introduced me as a next professor of his. But it wasn't true. He had just written, he'd done an independent studies project and written an essay about film, and so about Armenian film, of course. And I read it, I guess, and gave him a grade or something. But he was writing for the varsity, and his names, as Marcia McLuhan once said, names count. A name like Adam Egoyan stands out. And so I knew him as the critic for the varsity, film critic.
Newspaper.
What's that?
It was the newspaper, not the varsity.
Really?
No, the newspaper. There were two college papers. One was called the newspaper, the other was called the varsity. And the only reason I know that is because I wrote for the varsity, and we would always joke about being
I'm not, back then maybe. And I have no memory of the newspaper. I have no memory of many things, obviously. But there was a feeling in the air of both film. People were really interested in film, taking it sort of seriously. And as I said, around the world, not just here, almost no one they might have been academics, but they weren't getting paid to be film academics to around the time it happened here. Many people were just aficionados. And there was also a slight nationalism, more than slight. It was the early years of Anansi Press, of Margaret Atwood wrote, I can't remember the name of it, Notes of but it's about Canadian culture versus American culture. So I would say the courses we gave were part of a movement. They certainly weren't, all those things would have happened whether we had been teaching here or not. And in fact, the people most important did, those students did go on to become filmmakers, amongst other things. I think all of them would have, to be honest, whether they'd taken a course or not. Ron Mann claims he was a student of mine. He's a good friend. I have no memory of him as a student. I just remember meeting him on the beach in Cannes. Jim, who's here doing film and things. I think all these people, with a few exceptions, would have done it, whether we'd been giving the courses here or not. On the other hand, I think once it started to roll the way Cam and these people got it rolling, you really did have a place. You didn't have to be an autodidact. And you could, learn to do, you could learn from other people.
Anyone else wanting to weigh in on the question of
I was just wondering, to turn this question to the audience.
Yes.
How many people who are here who are graduates of the program are working now or have worked in, let's say, a film or film culture adjacent position at some point in there? Yeah.
Wow. How many of you, whether you are working or not, have made films or done other studying, whether or not you're actually working or getting paid? There you go. Yeah.
Thank you. That was brilliant. I think, does anyone have any other thoughts? Otherwise, we can go to the open forum stage. Yeah, Cam.
What I'm wanting to do is make sure that the first two directors of the program get the honor that they deserve. And I don't know how many people remember Gino Matteo and Wendy Rolfe. They were marvelous leaders for us. Gino Matteo was the director of the program for 10 years, and he got the things off the ground. Gino was very suave, very personable, very likable, and smooth. He had to take our program as we conceived it, and in meetings with Kay and Joe and myself and others, we set up a program that stayed in place for 19 years at least, with all of the courses that we had on campus categorized so that they made sense. It was a very coherent, cohesive program. And he took that from committee to committee to committee, and Gino was successful. Now, Gino was working out of St. Michael's College, where he taught a course in film making and a course in screen writing and script writing in alternate years. He did this on almost no budget at all. He was very courageous to do it, and there has not been anything like it ever since his retirement, because that was the sort of thing he did. Gino was trained as an English scholar. He had a PhD in Shakespeare, taught Shakespeare at St. Michael's, and had his earliest jobs with TV Ontario, where he did programs on Shakespeare. It was on the basis of this that he got made the first director, because he was a member of the English department. As I mentioned earlier, the original dean, Bob Green, was an English professor. He was looking for a tenured professor to be the director of the program, and Gino was the logical person to do it. But Gino was working out of St. Michael's College. There was no secretarial staff that was looking after cinema studies. There was, first of all, as we know, there was no building, and then there was the building, and the secretarial staff came only much later. And that came after Wendy Rolfe from Spanish was made the director. Wendy remained the director for 9 years. Wendy was brilliant. Wendy came into the University of Toronto on the highest admission scholarship available, called the Prince of Wales Scholarship. She was from Smith Falls, Ontario, and she had this fantastic record from her high school doing the old grade 13 examinations, and she was number one in the province. Wendy was brilliant. Wendy was also bubbly. Wendy reminded me so much of Julie Andrews, bubbly at her best. But Wendy was also very professional. She was a wee bit Sigourney Weaver in the working girls. So there was all that quality that was there, and she took charge. She took charge of a program that had been there in place for 10 years. The program did not change for the next 9 years, but she saw through it to get more and more faculty. And the job of the director has always been, or at least always was until then, to get down on your knees and beg from those deans and from those chairs of departments to let somebody good teach the courses. Wendy did it. But not only did she do this, she got a secretary for us. There was a designated secretary in cinema studies in the early 1980s that she got. And Wendy made her own office for the first time. The director held an office in here, in his college. Before that, yes, Chino had had an office he never went to because he didn't need to. He was at St. Michael's College. He was teaching at St. Michael's College. Wendy did. Next thing she did that was very, very important was she got projectors. She got 35 millimeter projectors here for this particular room. And that was a story in itself because we did not have 35 millimeter projectors. We were showing 16 millimeter films, not 35 millimeter films. But one of the instructors in our program, by the name of Tony Vicari, insisted that his films, the Italian neo-realistic films, had to be shown in 35 millimeter. And he just happened to have a nice Italian friend who was the manager of the St. Clair movie theater up on St. Clair Avenue. So the screenings for the Italian cinema class, and they had hundreds of students at that time in that class, they would meet on Wednesday nights at the St. Clair Movie Theater to see, with a 35 millimeter projection, their old Rossellini or Fellini or Antonioni films there, with a big break so that they could have a pizza break in the middle of the screenings. And the pizza breaks were meant so that all the friends who had come, you were allowed, if you were a student, to bring your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your husband, your wife, your parents, your grandparents, and the whole Italian community of Toronto seemed to turn up at the St. Clair Movie Theater to see the 35 millimeter films. Well, one of the deans, that was Robin Armstrong, heard about this and said, I don't think that's academically good. You should be screening your films on campus in a campus projection. Well, Wendy explained, we can't do that for our nice Tony who wants to show things in 35 millimeter because we have no projectors. So he did this. He got our 35 millimeter projectors up there. Then also, Wendy got us a budget. Do you realize that when we formed our committee, we had no budget? It was fine, we got a program, but we had no money to rent films. So what did we do? We opened a bank account at the Bank of Commerce. I was the treasurer, and we collected from each of the students money to pay for film rentals. And if you were a student in a full year course, it was $15 that you had to pay. We thought that was fine, $15. You were probably getting 24 film screenings for $15. And if you were in a half course, you could pay $10. Well, that seemed good too. So that money was there, and I was putting it in the bank for all of the courses. And finally, Robin Armstrong, the dean, heard, you not only don't have film 35 millimeter projectors and you're having courses off campus, but you've got a bank account that the university doesn't know about where you're using to rent films. Maybe you should have a budget. Well, Wendy said, yes, a budget would be a very good thing. So she got us a secretary. She got us a budget. She got us 35 millimeter screening facility. My goodness. And also, Wendy lived, she had a farm up in King Township. She and her husband, Tony, had a wonderful chalet there. So every year, the film instructors for one day of the year would go for a retreat to Wendy's farm. So the instructors and the TAs and a bunch of students, the students who were being active, would come along, and we would have a wonderful day in the country. Wendy is very, very much missed. So I think that we should pay tribute to those two wonderful people to whom we're all indebted. We wouldn't be here today without their leadership.
Thank you, Cam. Alberto, I would like to hold this year's retreat in a country chalet, and I want that on record. So I think we have time for some questions from the audience. Isabel, I see a few hands already. Shall we take 4 questions? This is how Liz Wijaya does it. Let's listen to 4 questions, and then, yeah. So let's do that. I see Jishin's hand up. And then let's take everyone in the back. There's one over there. So there's Jishin.
Hi, thanks to all the panelists. This is truly the CSI G7 Summit. And I wish we had more storytelling sessions like this. Okay, so the question is directed to Mr. Medjuck. Because as a PhD student at CSI right now, last week I was just out of curiosity. I was searching for the earliest kind of film dissertations ever written in U of T. And amazingly, I think 4 of the earliest, by you, by William Rocket, by Ruth Ann Dwyer, and by Jeanette Slonio-Walski, like they were all directed by, supervised by your supervisor, which is Joseph Skorecki. Yeah, and when I was looking him up...
He was a good friend, but... I mean, okay, I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Oh, yeah. Because I was looking up him, and it turns out that he was like a Nobel Prize nominated novelist.
I don't know if he was ever nominated. People thought he should be. Joseph was, I met Joseph because, you'll be sorry you asked. I was sitting in my office over on 63 St. George, and this thing crossed my desk which said, there's a Czech refugee. He's a noted writer in Czechoslovakia. And I looked, and he had translated Raymond Chandler into Czech. So I was really impressed. Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett. So I met him, and it turned out he'd written a screenplay that had been made, The End of a Priest. He's an actor he and his wife Zdena were actors in A Report on the Party and Its Guests. And he was a huge star in Czechoslovakia. And he was in San Francisco with Allen Ginsberg, I think, when the Russians invaded. He went back to Czechoslovakia. After a couple of days, they left again, they got out, and he came to Canada. He had some friends here, and he was just getting any odd job he could get. So someone asked if I could help him. So he did get, Joseph taught English, even though it wasn't his first language. He knew more about, particularly to be honest, American literature than most of us did. So he got a job teaching American literature. I think we got him to give a course on Czech film. I edited a book he wrote. I had a magazine with friends called Take One, and Joseph did a book called All the Bright Young Men and Women, a history of the Czech New Wave, or whatever we called it at the time. And he mainly taught English, strangely enough. I don't know if he taught in the Slavic studies or whatever or not. And he continued to publish, and he published 3 or 4 great, and one of the proudest things in my life is that he dedicated, I think, his best short story, the English translation, to me, a story called The Bass Saxophone. But I felt bad about making him be my thesis supervisor, because I was just getting into semiotics. I didn't use the word semiotics, but I basically wrote a lot about signifiers. And as Joseph said, it gave him a headache.
Clearly, it was a persistent interest because
But
he
I didn't know he'd
directed
done other
4
people's,
dissertations on films. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. And then we'll
Sorry,
take a
just-
few more questions. There's
Bliss, can
one
I
over
just
there in the
add
back.
something?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, just anecdotally, at a certain point when I was a TA, I think for Bart, I would sometimes be in Bart's office, and Bart was in this big office that was a double office that he shared with Joseph. They both smoked like chimneys. And Joseph had the worst, stinkiest cigars. And it's a wonder I'm still alive, because the cloud of smoke in that office was just amazing.
I have a different anecdote. Joseph Szwarecki's All the Bright Young Men and Women is an amazing book on the Czech New Wave, and it was my favorite source when I wrote about Vera Chytilova's Daisies. So that's, I mean, I think he's an amazing Czech film scholar. Okay, so there was a question over there in the back, yeah, in the mask. Yep. So let's take that question and then, okay. And then right in front of that person, Isabel is another.
I just wanted to test to make sure this is working. I'm from a different department, and I'm not trying to criticize this working group, but can you tell me more about why you chose this field if like what you create might be heavily criticized and maybe the public doesn't like it, but maybe it's still technically a masterpiece and ahead of its time? Why would you still work on something if you can't get consensus from the rest of the world at large?
Are you talking about working on a film, or are you talking about working on creating an academic program? What are you talking about?
Film in general. Like I just watched Snow White. Everyone says it sucks, but it's actually good. Like that's just a good example.
Right. I hear that question. Thank you. If you would pass the mic to the person in front of you. Yeah. And then we'll get it to you, sir. Yeah. Go ahead.
Question? Or?
Yes,
okay.
please.
Hi, I also must admit I'm not a graduate of U of T. I went to York University for film production, but I was really interested in the discussion of the development of the graduate program at CSI. And I just wanted to ask if the development of it was based on what you as directors were interested in and inclined towards with cinema research, or whether it was based on the research of the wider faculty.
A question about the development of the graduate program, and then we'll take one more question. We see you, Kay. We'll go to you in a.
Oh, she doesn't want to ask.
Oh, okay. All right.
So actually, my question could go to quite a few people. One section was actually missed, and that was the mid-1990s, when we actually hired out of the drama department, I think it was Carol Flynn, and with the idea of trying to create the graduate program through the drama department. So I guess that's to Charlie. So what happened? Because it went from like about 1994, 95 to maybe 1998.
Yeah.
Okay, so two questions. One was on the development of the grad program. So we'll give them a moment to answer this. And then the other was about the mid-90s and Carol Flynn.
I guess they're both going to fall on me, at least initially. The grad program, the development of the grad program, I think, was a consensus amongst the faculty that were present at the time, the so-called core faculty. And I think what we were trying to do was make sure that in some ways we were honoring the spirit of our undergraduate program in our graduate curriculum. So we wanted to make sure we had a balance of theory, history, and analysis. And so when we were creating the core courses, for example, those were the sort of the cornerstones. But we also, I remember at the time, the dean, who ended up being our current president, not the dean of arts and science, but he was the graduate dean. He was the vice dean graduate at that time, Merritt Gertler. He said, but you need something else. You need to do something that distinguishes you from whatever other grad programs are being developed at the same time or are in place in Canada. And the idea was to do this internship. And that kind of goes back to Bliss's last question. It gave those students who were going to do, remember we were only an MA at that time, an opportunity to start to do a job within the culture industry of Toronto if they weren't thinking of necessarily going on to do a PhD. And I think that that's still something that's present for the MA students. They can do a major research paper or they can do an internship. And I think that was an interesting innovation. We also had to make sure we weren't doing what York was already doing, because I think York already had its graduate program in place.
Mike.
The 90s. Well, remember how I said that U of T really thought to be something you had to have graduates. So there was an abortive attempt to do this through the Graduate Center for Study of Drama, as it was called at the time. And they believed that, I don't know, Cam may be able to fill some of this in because he certainly was on the committee that hired me. But they thought, okay, we'll start by having dedicated faculty who can teach theory and history. And so Carol Flynn was hired to do the theory, I was hired to do the history. But the only students that we would have in our courses would be drama center students who were themselves still pursuing drama degrees. So the whole thing was a bit wonky as an idea. And of course, in short order, Carol Flynn, I hope I'm not revealing too much here on a personal level, but Carol Flynn believed her husband, who was also an academic, would be hired at U of T. He was not. And so she disaffected, found another place where both of them could be hired, and they went off to the University of Arizona. I was left teaching these grad students who really didn't know anything about film. And finally, I won't get too much into the personal biography part of this, but I came up for tenure, and the dean said to me, you can either stay at the drama center, where there seemed to be nothing going on at this point, or you can have your degree converted to arts and science, because I was an SGS appointment, so I was 100% SGS, School of Graduate Studies. And I was like, where's the door? How fast can I go? And I ended up being cross-appointed at history, because at that time still, cinema could not hold a tenure stream appointment in majority. So I think I don't know if I was the first, possibly. I guess Carol was the first person to have that, and then I eventually became the second, and then Corinn after me. So Cam, you could probably fill in a little bit more about that story, sad history.
Well, there's a great deal of irony in this, because in our undergraduate classes, we often talked about the difference between drama from theater and film. And we kept talking about how, film has a narrator, and the narrator is the camera, and theater does not have a narrator, it's show. It's the difference between show and tell. So we were insisting on this for years and years and years. There are a few plays that do have narrators, think of Our Town, but they're exceptional. So here we were trying to find a place, since we wanted a graduate program. We felt that students shouldn't all have to go to the United States to get their master's or their PhDs. They should have a place here, and Toronto was a very good place. So we were encouraging this, but we had to place it somewhere. So we had to back up on our objections to drama and approach the drama center and say, would you like to have a cinema stream? And they reluctantly took it. Some, again, depended on the administration. Certain directors of the Graduate Center for Drama were enthusiastic about this, and others weren't. And it was because of the ones who weren't that eventually it folded, really, and some alternative had to be chosen. So that's my story. I always come back to the deans and the directors of these organizations as being the villains. Well, I think that was possibly the case there.
Thank you, Cam. Can we take 2 other questions? Are there other questions? There were so many, and now, okay, there's one right here. Thank you, Isabel.
Well, I was in Joe's 1975 class, and I did get a very good mark. But so my question's a bit different. With the change in the way people see movies and TV and Netflix, and really the whole change in the whole idea of cinema and storytelling and film, how will that change cinema studies going forward? I'm not a cinema studies student, but I'm very curious how you're going to adapt to that.
The one thing I'd say is I was here a couple of years ago and someone said in the department, cinema no longer has its primacy in the culture. And I think that's true. I used to be able to ruin dinner parties by saying, let's not talk about movies. And no one knew what else to talk about. Whereas you wouldn't do that nowadays. No one's going to talk about movies anyway. They're going to talk about a streaming serial they saw or something. So I don't know the answer. What do they call the place in New York? The Museum of the Moving Picture. You may have to start calling this the moving image. I think it's moving image, is it? Yeah. They may have to make it a department of moving image. Anyone else want to answer that depressing question?
Well, I'll just say that when Charlie was talking about what we were thinking about when putting together our graduate programs, one thing I remember that we were playing with is with the PhD program, we actually wanted to call it a degree in cinematic media. And we got pushback from the dean's office.
Who wants a PhD in that?
Yeah, so they didn't think it was a nice sounding degree, and so we stuck with cinema studies. But at that point, we were absolutely thinking of what we did as the study of cinematic media, because already in our classrooms, even though most people were trained in cinema studies proper, they were incorporating televisual objects of study and digital media and other things into what they were doing. And then while I was director, we made a hire of somebody who really works much more on media than cinema, which is Scott Richmond. And so that became sort of a way of formalizing a tendency and a trend that we were already pursuing as a program, but that also the field had been pursuing. So I think that this has absolutely been germane to what we've been doing for a long time, although we do maintain a kind of emphasis on cinema. There's been an incorporation of other media forms for many, many years.
I think
On the other hand, people still study Sophocles and Shakespeare. So maybe they'll study cinema as art history.
I mean, most programs now are called film and media. We're in the minority. I think it's NYU and us are the only ones left. But.
So I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank everyone for such a great conversation. Let's give everyone a hand. Yay.